Hello, I'm Robert Greenwald, director of Suppress, the film you're about to see. The film is upsetting, it's emotional, and its goal is to drive each and every one of you in the audience to take action. The brave people who came forward, the angry people who came forward, the people whose vote has been suppressed and taken away from them. The goal of the film is to take their voices, expand their voices, and to reach into the heart and souls of each one of us so that we are motivated to take action, to fight for democracy, and to do what we can to make sure voting suppression is stopped. Thank you for watching. We look forward to the conversation after the film.
Georgia's tight race for governor is getting national attention.
Brian Kemp is not only the Republican gubernatorial nominee, he's Georgia's Secretary of State.
Stacey Abrams looking to make history by becoming the nation's first female African-American governor.
Volunteers are picking up phones and knocking on doors across the state.
Come in and register to vote.
We are very excited to register as many people as we possibly can.
What do we want?
Register to vote!
When do we want it?
Today!
I come as one, but I stand as 10,000.
Pull back that veneer. And you see something really rotten happening. It's almost like termites coming in. They're in the wood. They're eating the wood away. And you don't even realize your house is getting ready to collapse until it's almost too late.
We have a historic decision today, striking down a key part of the Voting Rights Act, a civil rights law passed back in 1965.
The Supreme Court essentially said racism is over, and these communities don't need to pre-clear these changes anymore.
This decision leaves virtually unprotected minority voters in communities all over this country.
We are witnessing a tidal wave of voter suppression around the country.
If you look at Alabama,
Arkansas, North Carolina,
Ohio,
Kansas, North Dakota,
Michigan,
Wisconsin,
and Georgia, which is becoming ground zero.
We've got to understand, this isn't a Klan cross burning. This stuff is very bureaucratic, it's very mundane, it's very routine, but it is lethal.
For spacious skies, for amber waves of grain, for purple mountain majesty above the fruited plain.
My name is Bobby Jenkins. I live in Cuthbert, Georgia. The county is Randolph County. I spent about almost 35 years in education. I'm a superintendent of schools.
My name is Loretta Brown. I live in Morgan, Georgia, and I grew up in Randolph County. I am the state advisor for the Georgia NAACP Youth and College Division.
My name is Lewis Brooks. I live in Thomaston, Georgia, Upson County, and I've been living here my whole 89 years, except the 2 years I spent in service in Korea. In I believe it was 55 or 56, that's when they started to letting black people vote in Upson County. When I went to register to vote, it was tough. They asked me all kind of questions to try to keep me from registering. I passed the test. Once I got my voter right, I decided I wasn't going to let anything stop me from voting. Because I used to walk. You go up the street here, across the next street over there, I walk over there and walk back and vote. And I didn't miss a voting, except when they closed the poll. I'm a citizen. It's my right to vote and speak my opinion.
I saw this ad saying that there was a proposal to close 7 of the 9 precincts in Randolph County. I said, what?
Then they put it in the papers that they was closing polls, costing them too much money.
First of all, Randolph is a poor county. Just to give you an example of what it would mean, there's a community benevolence a little north of town. Had that precinct been closed, some of those individuals would have to go 30 miles round trip in order to vote. It would have been a terrible hardship on our poor, on our elderly, and on those who are least able to afford transportation.
No, I got disabled and I couldn't do no driving. I know I couldn't afford to go that far to vote. This was on a black neighborhood. It made me feel like they would close it down to keep the black people from voting, because most black people vote Democrat. They only closed one white voting place. Everybody from out here in the black side had to go clean over there to the white section to vote. We're human, and we have our rights to vote just like anybody else.
Voters in Randolph County, Georgia are outraged.
Randolph County residents expressed their concerns with the Board of Elections.
Our citizens turned out in full force. They were behind us 100%, trying to keep those polling places open.
Convenience of the voter. You all are not considering that at all.
There's no disenfranchisement for the African Americans.
I went to the meeting, find out that they were trying to close 7 of the precincts.
Got to stand up. You cannot allow this to continue.
They gave a couple of reasons, saying it would save money. The other one was that several of the polling places were not ADA compliant. The thing that was so ironic is we voted that way in May. You know, they weren't any worse in November than they were in May.
It will be impossible for rural voters without vehicles to vote on Election Day. It will be impossible for them. They will have to walk 3.5 hours just to get from one of these polling places to Cuthbert and Shellman.
We did petition to keep it open. Pressure from the residents, civil rights organization, speaking up, speaking out.
They called the meeting to order, and they only had one motion. They voted to keep them open.
The news of what was happening here in Randolph County went worldwide.
The incident that we experienced threw the spotlight on everything else that had been going on. You know, we find out that in the state of Georgia, there were over 200 other polling places had been closed.
If you move a poll 4 miles, it is the equivalent of a 20% drop in black voter turnout. That's what shutting down these polls mean.
With 2 months to go, the race is heating up in Georgia.
Stacey Abrams' campaign feel they have the momentum behind them, and many of the polls we've seen so far support that.
You know, the Democrats are working hard, registering all these minority voters, and if they can do that, they can win these elections in November.
There's no law in Georgia that requires the Secretary of State to process voter registration forms on a particular timeline.
Kemp withheld putting the names of thousands on the voter registration list until after the election.
80% were African Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans.
Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on.
This is Fulton County.
Money for the golden bay.
Linda Marshall is my name.
On the prize. Hold on.
Most of my professional career has been in public service of one kind or another, as a teacher, as a government worker. I moved here in August of this year, but because of my emphasis on always being registered and always having the ability to vote, I did that almost immediately when I got here. Of course, I also knew the importance of the upcoming election, and I wanted to be a part of that history.
Keep your eyes on.
It got closer and closer and closer to the election, and I was getting a little bit concerned, so I called the Secretary of State's office. My name is not on the roll. They can't tell me where it is. So all of that paperwork that I sent in, I don't know where it is. I'm 65, and for the first time, I did not get a chance to vote in a very close election of historic importance and proportion. Welcome to Georgia.
Hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on.
The midterm election in Georgia is only 29 days away.
Civil rights leaders say Kemp is illegally removing people from Georgia's voters list.
Republican Brian Kemp has already gotten the backing of our current president.
Thousands are purged from Georgia's voting rolls.
Purged from Georgia's voting rolls. 890,000. They had no idea they could vote.
Other states use the same
over who's been removed from the voter roll.
There has been instance after instance of unlawful voter purging. States are removing voters, many of whom have actually been found to have been eligible but were unlawfully removed from the rolls.
I received the purge notice. So I open it up and I read the first sentence. I, along with 380,000 Georgians, received the same notice.
That's an especially pernicious way to prevent people from voting, because once you register to vote, you would think that you should be able to remain on the rolls. And once you're removed from the rolls, you cannot vote.
I went out and got the mail, and there were 2 letters in there. They looked official. You're hereby notified that the city of Thunderbolt has challenged your right to vote. The city of Thunderbolt states that you no longer reside within the municipality. My license is valid, my address is valid, I own this home. Why are you questioning my right to vote?
You know, the purges, they've been going on for decades, maybe over a century in this state.
If you haven't voted in the last few elections, they'll purge you as if you must not be in the state anymore. If you move within the same county, they'll purge you, assuming you're not living in Georgia anymore. If you don't return a postcard from the Secretary of State, they'll purge you, because to them it means you're not a resident at this address. All of these tactics specifically and disproportionately target people of color, poor people, the elderly, all of whom tend to vote for Democrats.
Brian Kemp is notorious for erasing the polls and purging people right before the election deadline.
You have a candidate at the top of the ticket who is responsible for maintaining the integrity of the election.
He needed to have his hands on the levers.
You have an umpire who is also playing in the game.
Less than 20 days away from the midterms now.
The race for Georgia's governorship is a toss-up.
Literally is a dead heat.
This governor's race is already won for the history books, but it's also seeing record numbers of requests for absentee ballots, especially from African-American voters.
At a time where we're seeing roughly almost half of the people who've turned in an absentee ballot are people of color, that's a really, really good sign for Stacey Abrams.
We caught them off guard by running such a large-scale program and mailed 1.6 million African Americans an absentee ballot application.
In this midterm election, the absentee ballot requests are even outperforming presidential years. So that is startling and eye-popping and something that we need to dig in on to see what's going on there.
My name is Norman Broderick. I'm in Powder Springs, Georgia, Cobb County. I did 24 years in the military, deployed to Iraq twice, Bosnia, Saudi Arabia. I voted absentee before when I was deployed. When I was in Iraq the first time, I voted absentee, and when I was in Iraq the second time, I voted absentee. The absentee ballot is a very important tool that exists to allow people, not only just the military, but anybody who happens to be away from their voting station, to be able to cast their vote.
My name is Peggy Hsu. I'm from Johns Creek, Georgia. I left Georgia for DC in the beginning of October, and before I left, I mailed out my absentee ballot application so that our registrar would send an absentee ballot to my new DC address.
I work at U.S. Army Central, which is located at Shaw Air Force Base in Sumter, South Carolina. I'm away from home during the week. I knew I wasn't going to be able to get back to Georgia to vote. I could only do this absentee. I filled out everything I was supposed to fill out. I sent the documents in. I got confirmation that it was received. And to my surprise, I did not receive my absentee ballot.
I checked my mailbox every day. It was like nearing the end of the month. And so I started calling the voter protection hotline. I called my registrar. I sent emails, and it was really getting close to the election date. And I never received my ballot. The election day came and went, and I wasn't able to vote in the end.
When I contacted my wife and asked her about it, I think it was a couple of days before the election, it came here. And I tried contacting the Georgia Elections Board. I was told they did receive my absentee ballot request. Everything was filled out correctly, but that they mailed it to the wrong address. And she admitted that yes, they did mess up. It was their fault. But there was nothing I could do about it. It's too late. It's over with, and my vote will not be counted during this election.
It was probably one of the most frustrating things I've ever experienced. After having spent, my entire college career very invested in the political process, it was, like a punch to the gut.
It still pisses me off to this day. Being in Baghdad, voting absentee was easier than being 4 hours away trying to vote absentee in South Carolina.
I took to Facebook, and like the millennial activist that I am, I recounted my experience in a Facebook post. I wrote, "This is what happened. I wasn't able to vote, and if you had a similar experience, let me know." And my friend from high school, she reached out to me and she said, "I also had struggles trying to get my ballot in, voting absentee."
So I submitted an absentee ballot. It came 2 days right before Election Day.
Over the course of 48 hours, we had 40 people. So many people in our immediate Facebook circle knew somebody who had a similar experience to us.
People have requested it far in advance. Some people just didn't get their vote in.
That was when we really realized that this was not an isolated incident. It was a much bigger issue and a much more deeper rooted sort of phenomenon that was going on statewide.
I did speak with the Board of Elections, and he just dismissed it as a hiccup. And he's like, "Oh, no, you don't really know what you're talking about." 40 cases, not really a hiccup. It's more of a wake-up call.
Today, we've worked to get answers about the claim that thousands of voters never got the absentee ballots they requested.
Great Tuesday morning, Election Day.
The race between Abrams and Kemp is literally neck and neck.
Their fate is now in the hands of voters.
The day is finally upon us.
The midterm elections are happening.
Voters head to the polls in one of the most intensely fought midterm elections. The race for Georgia's governorship is a toss-up.
I live in the South. I'm always worried about Election Day.
Have a great morning and go vote.
Oh yeah, gotta go vote today.
Voting started here in Georgia this morning, and if you think hitting the polls early will keep you from getting stuck on long lines, think again.
Voter Protection Hotline. How can I help you?
Voter Protection Hotline. How can I help you?
I've never seen one.
The line hasn't moved in over an hour. The line is running out.
I really thought I was going to be able to run in and run out like I usually do. The first thing I saw was just people everywhere. So we stood there for a while without moving. And then we would inch up. And then we wouldn't move. We had a lot of people with children there, pregnant mothers, elderly people. Some people have medical issues.
I took my son to school that morning, and then I went to vote at Ferguson Elementary, where I vote every election. The line just keeps getting long. The line was so long, through the school and wrapped around the building. The lines was crazy everywhere, all over the county. It was real long. I was in line for 2 hours. And I got to the door. That's when they was checking your ID before you go in. And she couldn't find my name. She directed me to go downtown Gwinnett. And I was like, I'm not gonna vote. And it was this older lady. She came over and she like held my hand and was like, please go do it. We need this. And I looked in her eyes and said, I will.
Registered somewhere else and they pulled it up in the system.
About 8 or 9, we started getting the calls about the long lines.
Long lines at the polling stations lead to low voter turnout. The research is just crystal clear on that.
Everyone in the world knew we were going to vote today. And in my neighborhood, there are no power cords. All these dedicated people waiting to vote. This is what we call voter suppression.
People were like upset and angry. I started calling the Secretary of State's office. I was either hung up on, placed on hold. They want people to go home and not vote. I ain't going nowhere. I'm gonna be right here.
The reason they sent me from Ferguson to the downtown Gwinnett was for the provisional vote. So I drove 25 minutes, and then when I got there, it was crowded in there. I waited 45 minutes to find out that's not where I needed to be. She told me that this was the wrong place and that I can go back to Ferguson. I had to call back and redo my schedule. So now, the voting not only cut on my time, cut on my money.
When we went in, filled out all the paperwork, had the ID, took it up to the lady. I had mine in my hand. One hand had hers in the other, because she's legally blind. So we go give it to the lady, and she goes to scan Barbara's ID. Wow. And so she looked up at Barbara. She said, well, Miss Barbara, when was the last time you voted? My sister got strong. I've been voting since I was 18 years old. And I'm 82.
Yeah, I was disappointed.
She was a little upset. My girl wanted to vote, and they were trying to keep her from voting.
Since I became a citizen, I have not missed an election. I showed up, and a very nice lady, she looked at my ID and said, no, you're not registered. And I said, no, wait a second. Here's my registration card, and showed them that I was registered. And they said, yeah, but your name is Del Rio with a space, but your voter ID says Del Rio one word, and therefore it doesn't match. In the voter registration, my name shows as Del Rio with a space. My ID is Del Rio, no space. That was a non-match. I said, this is not legal and I need to be allowed to vote. After much discussion, they said to me, this time we'll allow you to vote, but it's a little bit like they're doing me a favor. The right to vote should be something that we should make easier rather than more difficult.
Latinos and Asian Americans are 6 times more likely than white Georgians to be cut from the voter rolls because of exact match, and Black Americans are 8 times more likely to be cut because of exact match.
I have voted in every election, and all of a sudden I'm not there.
Controversy surrounds the state's exact match law that put the registrations of 53,000 voters, most of them African Americans, on hold because of discrepancies in the way their names are spelled in state databases.
People of color have names that are a little bit less typical, and that's where the errors are at their highest. Brian Kemp knows this.
A group of students will not have their voices heard at the polls, at least not in Georgia.
They're turning a bunch of students away over here.
were showing up here and at the Booker T. Washington location, and their names were not on the actual roll.
The students was being turned away. I talked to over 50 students that morning.
First, they told me I was at the wrong polling station.
They said, you didn't get registered. I was like, what do you mean?
And there was only about 4 voting ballot booths.
They didn't process my registration didn't go through. I walked back to my dorm and said, I guess I just won't vote.
Just before I went to vote, I had been in an African American history class where we were actually talking about voter suppression, about what was it like for people that were going to vote. I filled out a little slip of paper, gave it to the poll workers. They looked up at me and they said, it's coming up in our system as though you're not a citizen of the United States. I just sort of looked at them like they had two heads. I'm sorry, I was born in New York, what?
When I got to the front of the line, they informed me that I was registered to vote, but not in Dougherty County. They were telling me that I was registered back home in Winter Robins, where I was from, and I've never voted there. I've never even been registered there.
The thing was that I had brought proof that I was a U.S. citizen. I had with me my driver's license, my passport card, and my Emory student ID, but they would not look at the passport card whatsoever to prove that I was a citizen. I walked out crying. What I learned in history class just hours before, this happened to me in 2018.
I had been through and participated in voter registration drive on campus, within a community. It was just like, wow, after all of this, I'm not gonna be able to vote myself.
When I was growing up, voting was a thing. It was an event. So little me is trailing behind my parents watching them vote.
My parents would take me to the voting polls every time when I was little. I would go in and I would help them fill out the bubbles.
I get a chance to vote, and then you get there and the experience is just terrible, and you have to call your mom and be like, why is this so hard? You never told me it would be this hard.
This was huge for us because Stacey Abrams was actually a Spelman alum. History would have been made, and it would have been made by my Spelman sister.
If there is no one who gets to 50% tonight, Robin, there will be a runoff in December.
We'll find out as the day and evening goes on.
Voter Protection Hotline, how can I help you?
Are they letting you know? Are you really kidding me?
Old people who can't vote, there's young people who can't vote, there's people in every county who can't vote.
It just created this intense fog of confusion across the state.
Been here for 3 hours, 4 or 5 hour wait, 5 hours.
This is way, way too long for us to stay and vote.
How long have you waited in line here?
About 3.5 hours.
And you decide you can't stand it? You can't take it anymore? Are you going to go home?
I'm hurting. I'll be back. I got to go take some medicine.
It was really good. The lines weren't too long and everyone was super helpful.
We don't hardly ever have to wait here. It's always a pleasant experience up here.
If you have a fixed resource, an easy way to suppress the vote is to just make that resource unavailable to the people who you don't want to vote. And that's exactly what happened in the 2018 election here in the state of Georgia. In places like North Fulton County, which are wealthy, there were more machines than anyone could ever use. In black neighborhoods, there were a quarter of the number of machines that were needed to service the population.
Lots of people left without voting.
It was people just dropping off when it became 2 hours, 3 hours. 4th hour is very heartbreaking.
All it takes is a little walking away at 159 counties to influence an election. A little here, a little there, and then in a race like this, which was so close, there you go.
All night on Twitter, a trending topic, hashtag stay in line.
I had to go and pick my son up. He had to be picked up before 6. I picked my son up and he went with me and sat in the car. And then I went back to Ferguson Elementary. And by this time, the evening crowd is there and the line has tripled. And I was like, oh, there is no way. Just for my one vote, it took me like 6 hours. And I wanted to give up because I promised that elderly lady outside that I would do it.
5 hours, so about 5 hours took me to vote. It sucks the life out of you.
I'd been in people's homes, I'd been in their neighborhoods, I'd held their hands. And so to get to election night and to start hearing more and more stories of voter suppression, to hear more and more from people who were told that they couldn't vote or who were turned away or had to give up because of 4-hour lines, that broke my heart.
Republican Brian Kemp holds a narrow lead over Democrat Stacey Abrams.
Tens of thousands of ballots left to be counted in this election. They were counting provisional ballots for hours.
Provisional ballots are basically placebos. They're being given to voters to kind of shut them up, make them go away.
The next day, I was so excited because they were saying that it was a close race. I was like, oh, let me make sure that my vote count. So I called there, the number that was on the paper that I got from the voting poll. And she go, oh no, they counting every vote. You don't need to call. I called my mom to double check. My mom worked for the poll for 20-some years. And she said, no, that's not true. You call back to make sure the vote count. And someone else says to the phone, and I got the same thing. No, you don't need to call back. We counting all the votes.
We just started discovering so many people voting provisionally. We realized, oh, you voted provisionally, so you might have to come back here the next day and show your ID. Is that something you know? And they're like, no, I already voted. Like, I'm good.
But you have to come back within 3 days with the documentation to prove you are who you say you are. When you have a large working class population that has to punch a clock, that's really tough. You've lost pay from work trying to vote. That's a poll tax.
Hi, this is Stacey from Gwinnett County Elections.
I wanted to confirm if my vote was counted or not.
All right, what is your last name?
Kimball.
Let's see, there was no participation.
So does that...
You weren't given credit for voting.
My vote was not counted.
It looks like it on election day, yes, ma'am.
No, I thank you. Goodbye.
Last night, my opponent ended her campaign. The election is over, and I'm honored to be Georgia's governor-elect.
I acknowledge that former Secretary of State Brian Kemp will be certified as the victor in the 2018 gubernatorial election. But to watch an elected official baldly pin his hopes for election on the suppression of the people's democratic right to vote has been appalling. This is not a speech of concession. Because concession means to acknowledge an action is right, true, or proper. As a woman of conscience and faith, I cannot concede that.
This is systematic. If you look at what has happened across this country in the last 5 years, 40 states have passed some kind of law to make it more difficult for people to vote.
In Arkansas, the Supreme Court upheld a measure requiring voters to show photo ID.
North Carolina, where it targeted African Americans. Alabama, the governor was shutting down DMVs.
In Ohio.
Kansas, tens of thousands of people were prevented from voting.
Texas allows a concealed gun license to vote, but will not include college IDs.
Indiana, they purge 500,000 voters.
Wisconsin, where a recent photo ID law may have handed the 2016 election to Donald Trump.
We lost 41,000 voters. I think it changed the outcome of the election in the state of Wisconsin.
America. We are not going to let them take from us what our grandparents and parents fought and suffered and died to give us in the first place.
We are here to resist an ID law that is undemocratic, unconstitutional, and immoral.
People are demanding democracy. In Washington, there's a new Native American Voting Rights Act. New Mexico now has same-day voter registration. Colorado, Nevada, Florida, and Arizona all passed laws restoring voting rights to those formerly incarcerated. Indiana blocked a law that would have allowed purging. New York, activism led to an expansive package of voting reforms. Michigan, a ballot initiative to end extreme partisan gerrymandering. And there's national legislation now to restore the Voting Rights Act.
These efforts are being fought in the streets. They are being fought in the city councils. They are being fought in the state legislators.
We belong together. We are all part of the fabric of this country, and we understand what's at stake.
Any voter suppression law is not just about black people. It is about America itself.
On my mother's dying bed at 92 years old, former sharecropper, her last words were, "Do not let them take our votes away from us."
We have the power to change this. We are going to vote you out so that we really do have fair and free elections.
Welcome to Unbound, the Bay Area Book Festival's virtual conversations. I'm John Diaz, and I'm going to be your moderator for a discussion today reflecting on the film Suppressed, The Fight to Vote, which you were just able to watch. Joining me, I'm glad to have filmmaker Robert Greenwald of Brave New Films and Phoebe Einzig-Roth, whose firsthand experience with voter suppression was featured in the film. Welcome to you both. Let me start with you, Robert. What was your inspiration for doing this documentary about voter suppression?
The inspiration was really a couple of things that came together. At Brave New Films, we're a very small nonprofit, so we have to be very thoughtful about what we decide to do, because it then means we're not doing 20, 30, 40 other things. So originally it started, we saw the news like everybody else about the suppression in Georgia. And I thought, well, you know, we can what's called aggregate. We'll put together different stories from the news and we'll make maybe a 3-minute or a 5-minute piece. And we started on it, and literally every day the researchers and the associate producers would come in with another story and another example. And it kept growing, and I started to realize, and we all started to realize, there is a bigger story here, and it's a story about systemic voter suppression. It's not about one individual, and it's not, as Carol Anderson says, about somebody in a white hood. It's a widespread, organized effort. And the way to do that was to do it with a longer film so we could touch each one of the stories of suppression.
You know, one of the striking things I found from your documentary was just the extent of voter suppression tactics, you know, that you found in Georgia. The closing of precincts, purging of voting rolls, missing absentee ballots, hours-long lines. Did you have any sense when you started? Why did you pick Georgia? Did you suspect that you were going to find what you found?
I had no idea. In this year, 2020, in the United States of America, we would find such extraordinary, racist, horrific voter suppression. It's organized, it's done at the highest levels in the government of Georgia, and it's done at the smallest levels. And as we were working on this film, I don't think there was a day that passed when myself, one of my colleagues would say, are we really hearing these stories today? Is this really the United States? Is this really our country? Because of how widespread it is. Again, it wasn't an accident. Unfortunately, lots of it was legal, and a lot of it started with the Supreme Court overturning the Voting Rights Act. and allowing this to go forward. But I didn't have a clue. And in fact, I'm a pretty cynical New York kind of guy. And if you told me in the beginning how widespread this was, I'd say, well, maybe it's a little bit of the boy who cried wolf. Are you sure? Well, it's way beyond what we knew or expected. And as we've been screening it around the country, we're now at 1,500, 1,600 screenings. They started out in homes and theaters and classrooms and churches. Now they're online. The response over and over again is very similar. I did not believe what I was seeing and what I was hearing.
Phoebe, I want to get your take. I thought the experience that you described in the film was really profound. The fact that you were studying voter suppression in your African American history class, and then what was it, a day after the lesson, you experienced suppression yourself. One of the things that strikes me is you came with so much documentation. Did you think you were going to have a problem when you went in to vote?
You know, I went in completely not knowing what it was going to be like. Not only had I changed states to go to school, but it was my first time voting in the first place. I had been with my parents to vote many, many times throughout my life, and it was just nothing like it was in Georgia. My experience was completely different from anything we had ever experienced in Boston. To answer your question, I really didn't think that I was going to experience voter suppression. In fact, I had been studying it in my history class that day, right before I went to vote. I walked from my history class to the voting polls, and we had been studying voter suppression that very same day. And I was like, oh, this could never be something that happens in 2020. We were, or 2018 when I went to vote. It was something that I really did, from the bottom of my heart, think that it was something I would read about in textbooks and never experience myself. And obviously that was a naive way of thinking, but I really did have to educate myself on the voter suppression that goes on to this day.
You mentioned in the film that you could hardly believe this was happening in 2018. What was the era that you were studying right before you went to vote? Was it the poll tax era, Jim Crow laws?
Yes, we were studying up until 1865. And then my second class was from 1865 to the present day. So we were studying sort of the entire history of African American history, and the era that we had been studying that day was actually the poll tax era, which coincidentally happened to fall on voting day.
Did your professors warn you that this, at that point, that it was your professor warn you that this is still going on today? I mean, or did it totally catch you by surprise?
It completely caught me by surprise. I think it sort of catches everyone by surprise. You never think it's going to happen to you. And especially as, my first time voting as a young college student, it completely caught me off guard. I grew up in a very liberal area, somewhere that doesn't really have much of a problem with voter suppression. And it was very shocking to me and very surprising and very upsetting to me when it happened.
Let's go back to Robert. One of the realities that your documentary shows that these moves were not random at all, whether the issue was closing precincts or the purging of voter rolls. It seemed that Democrats generally and African Americans specifically were disproportionately affected. At the end of your documentary, you run a list of some of the lawsuits that were filed in the wake of that Georgia election. Any sense of how, have any been resolved yet? Has there been any progress in the legal arena from some of the things that you documented?
Well, the lawsuits have been very important, and there's been some victories and some losses. And bear in mind, now that we saw what happened in the age of COVID in Wisconsin, where there was a concerted effort to suppress in a different way, they closed something like 500 or 600 of the polling stations, and they still insisted on having the election. So there's going to be another level of voting suppression where voting rights are literally taken away from people by using COVID as the way to do that. So there's going to be continuous lawsuits. There's going to be continuous organizing. The good news is more and more people are aware of it, and I hope the film is helping make people aware of it. You know, there's lots of good work that goes on in think tanks and reports and in journalism. What film can do, and I talk about this all the time at Brave New Films, we can put a face on policy. And by putting a face on policy, you humanize it, you connect it for an audience, and you help them viscerally feel what's going on. That's the other way I think film can be important. First, you reach the hearts, and then the mind will follow. So if we get people feeling the pain that Phoebe and many others went through, feeling the anger, feeling the rage, it can lead to the mind taking action and planning. How do we prevent this absolute fundamental attack on democracy from continuing?
Robert, I actually wanted to ask you about that because I thought really part of the power of the film were those very personal anecdotes of Georgians talking about what their vote means to them, as you were talking, Phoebe, their frustration, even their anger at having that taken away. Was it hard to find folks willing to talk about their experience?
Well, just before I answer that, Phoebe, you wanted to jump in?
Oh, I was just going to go off of your response, and I completely agree with you. I think that the whole reason that I decided to go public with my experience, and I, just to let you know, I wrote an original Facebook post, which I had really never posted on Facebook before that. And I felt that it was the best platform to sort of share my story. And I had a completely private Facebook and wrote the whole rant out thinking it would get maybe 2 people looking at it. And I was like, if it gets 2 people looking at it, that's 2 more people that are educated on my experience. And I had no idea that this was a huge, huge problem in Georgia. I really didn't. I was very naive about it. And it immediately just blew up. And I was like, well, if it's blowing up, this has to be a real problem. And my reasoning for sharing the story was I have a community that would be very supportive and would share my story and have other people, know what was going on, not just with me, but with other Georgians as well. And I felt like it was so important to tell my own experience and put a face to the experience that many people were having, whether it be that, they were denied their citizenship, like I was called not a citizen of the United States, which still to this day surprises me, or whether it be that, they had to vote provisionally, whatever. I think it's so important to get those stories out there and put a face to them.
Phoebe, it's really interesting in the documentary where you show some of the Facebook responses that you've gotten. Were most of them from college students? Because it seems like colleges have really become a battleground in voter suppression. We're seeing like in Texas where you cannot use a student ID to vote, but you can use a concealed weapons permit or fishing license or whatever. Is that mainly who you're hearing from, is your fellow college students?
So actually not at all. I heard from everyone. I heard from a lot of people who very much disagreed with my story and thought that it was fake or thought that I shouldn't have been able to vote in the state where I go to college, people who were obviously very uneducated on it. And then you got, people that were in college. You did have some of those who were like, well, yeah, you should have been able to vote. That's insane. And then you had, adults that agreed with me who were really trying to back up my story and educate people on the subject and saying, well, this is obscene. But I really had people responding from all over the place, all places. It was quite incredible, really.
Robert, Phoebe's experience was that of a college student, which I thought was pretty strong to have the message of somebody who is finally getting to vote. As Phoebe, you mentioned, you used to go with your parents to vote. But also, I thought really compelling in the documentary, Robert, were folks who were up there in age and had their whole life voting had been such a central part of who they were and how they felt becoming a full citizen.
Yes, older, particularly the older gentleman who's at the beginning of the story, he's 87, 88 years old. He talks about walking to his polling place. They closed the polling place. He didn't have the financial resources to take a cab or rent some vehicles. So he was going to be prevented from voting. And almost every screening that I attended, and I didn't attend all 1,600, members of the audience, particularly African-American members of the audience, would come to tears because of the resonance, because you see it in his face. You see the history that Phoebe was studying that very day about voter suppression. And again, the thought that we have to fight this battle on one level it's outrageous. This is a battle that was fought, that was won, and we should be able to move on. But it wasn't. And to that, I give such great credit to Phoebe and many of the other people in the film who we spent months and months finding and talking to, because one of the tasks I set for ourselves after studying it for a while, it was clear that there were 5, 6, 7, or 8 different tactics. So I wanted to find one story that would illustrate each one of the tactics. A student, someone whose polling place was closed, someone who had to wait online, long lines, absentee ballot, it goes on and on. So the, production folks were quite amazing. And it was so upsetting because there were so many stories out there that we were able to find ones to illustrate, and people who were willing to go on camera. It was interesting. Some people didn't want to talk to us. And I was curious why. Well, it turned out they were embarrassed that they had not voted. Now, can you imagine that? Here is this suppression, this oppression, this racist behavior, and the people who were denied, some of them, were feeling a sense of shame.
We've seen those pictures of people standing in long lines to vote, hours and hours. Certainly you documented it in Georgia, but as you mentioned, we've also seen it recently in Wisconsin. As was noted in your documentary, for some voters, especially those in lower wage jobs, it's a hit in their paycheck, as it was described in the documentary, really a modern poll tax. It's amazing what people go through in order to vote.
Yes, well, that was one of the things that convinced me there was a film to be made here. Because again, I saw the news, and you see it on, I don't try not to watch it, but you hear it or you read it. People said, oh, I'd wait 2-3 hours. And it just kind of passed over me. And then we did the interviews. And I'm looking around and I'm talking to my friends and colleagues and relatives. I said, and I'll ask the audience this, how long would you wait to vote? Would you wait a half hour, an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours? And almost nobody was willing to wait that long, except some of the wonderful folks in Georgia and now in Wisconsin. But that's such a fundamental way to take away people's right. And as one of the experts says, it's a question of resource allocation. What does that mean? It means in the white upper income areas, you have as many voting booths, you have as many registrars, so there's no waiting, as they say, there's no problems. And in the other areas where you want to suppress the vote, you come up with all kinds of reasons why there are not enough voting booths, there are not enough people to check you in, and there you have voter suppression.
Phoebe, as you probably know, a big issue in this country right now is the relatively low voter participation among younger people. Do you think folks of your age, your generation, when they see a documentary like this, is it going to inspire them to vote, or are they going to say, well, it's not worth it?
I can only hope that it will inspire them to vote. I know a bunch of my friends have watched the documentary and they've been very moved by it. I think as many older people are, I think younger people are equally as surprised when they see this movie and they're saying, wow, I had no idea that this was happening. And I think that, that should be an incentive to go vote. And that should be, the education that you need to say, okay, they might be trying to take my time, they might be trying to take my resources, but they're not going to take away my right to vote.
And I think one of the things this film shows is the sacrifice that Americans have gone through to earn that right to vote, not only with the civil rights movement, but Robert, you also featured a young man who had served in war and basically fighting for our franchise to vote, and to see it taken away this way was a great source of frustration to him.
Yes, and his line that it was easier to vote absentee ballot in Iraq than it was to vote from the neighboring state in Georgia sort of, grabbed everybody, because it was so clear and so specific that this is not an accident. These are the way resources are allocated. These are the way laws are changed. These are the way the folks who, as somebody else said, they want to choose the electorate rather than the electorate choosing them. So they're deciding who are the voters, eliminating the others, and therefore maximizing their chances by trying to stay in power, whatever means necessary. And as you were saying before, hopefully the film will be a tool to activate and energize people. If it turns them off from voting, then I have to throw myself under a bus or a truck, because we would have failed completely. And hopefully that's not the case. And at the end of virtually every screening, and the film is short, as you all saw, it's 33 minutes. The idea is to have a discussion, whether it's the League of Women Voters or the NAACP or a church or whatever it is, a discussion around what actions can be taken. That's one of the amazing things about a nonprofit, that his goal is not to monetize. So we don't have to have as many screenings where we charge people. Every screening is free. Every screening comes with a study guide if it's school, or a reflection guide if it's a faith community, and options. Here are all different organizations that you can work with in order to exercise that right. It's the great line, democracy is not a spectator sport. And hopefully this film and the other films we've done are ways to activate people to make sure they're not spectators sitting on the side.
It struck me that you had so much content to work with here that this easily could have been a 2 or 3 hour documentary. Instead, it's 35 minutes. It was part of your goal to make it more accessible, where people will, in this country with such short attention spans, will stay there for the whole time?
Yes. If you have a little time, I'll show you the 10-hour version later. But yes, it was definitely, and we learned with some of the other films we've done, which I think, varying degrees, some were stronger, some weren't as strong, but over and over again, we found that the shorter films provided a greater opportunity for people to organize afterwards. The standard documentary is generally around an hour and a half, and I think our Walmart film was about an hour and 45 minutes, but there's not a lot of emotional energy at that point to stay and plan actions. So, as a filmmaker, sometimes I want it to go longer, but ultimately my responsibility, all of our responsibilities, to the work we do, to the funders who give us from $5 to $500, to the foundations who support us. Our goal is to activate people. If people watch the movie, including you all, and don't take action, then we've failed. So keeping it shorter, having easy ways that people can get involved are part of our goal. And we actually spend more time now at Brave New Films and more staff time on the distribution and reaching people than we do on actually making the films, because the technology is so fantastic today, right? You can pick up your phone and anybody can make a film, but getting it out, reaching an audience, activating them, that's a critical part of our work.
Phoebe, I'm interested in your take as one of the subjects of the film. Excluding your own role, what did you find the most powerful or poignant moment of the film was for you?
Oh man, that's a difficult question. I was really just so moved by all of it. I just absolutely loved that it wasn't showing, 1 or 2 people. I think I loved that it sort of got at each of the different tactics that they were using. And in doing that, they showed many different people's perspectives. And I thought that was extremely powerful. And I thought that it sort of gave us an idea of the types of people who are going through this. But it was also it was just extremely powerful. I can't choose one part of the film because it was just all so incredible. But also, I will say, voting has sort of become, and this film really touched at that, sort of almost an esoteric notion. I think it's become, as Robert said, a spectator's view. And I think in showing films like this and making films like this, it becomes something that people know about. People know it's a problem. They want to fix the problem. They want to go out and vote. They're motivated, and it becomes less of that esoteric notion or spectator's notion.
Well, now that we're headed into the 2020 election, and a few things have changed in American society since then, there are tug of wars about voting rules in legislatures across the nation. We're seeing things like calls for voter ID requirements, narrowing of access points in some states, while others are really working to try and expand voting. California, for instance, is going to be sending every registered voter a mail-in ballot. I want to ask both of you, and we'll start with you, Robert. How do you think this pandemic is going to play into voter suppression?
Well, I think sadly, tragically almost, infuriating, it's going to be used by those who want to have less people vote. The current person who's the president at the moment said that openly, that if lots of people vote, Republicans will never get elected again, which is quite an awful statement, but also indicates why it's so important, why people who want to repress the vote have spent so much money and time and effort in all the different tactics that we expose in the film and all the different stories we tell. There's the whole piece of it, which we couldn't get into because a whole other film, would be the census and how that's organized, that as a way also to ultimately suppress the vote. But in the era of COVID, the efforts that should be made, right, which should be, everybody should be able to vote by mail, easily, simply, no problem. That's going to be resisted by folks who do not want lots of people to vote. So we're going to see that. We're going to see polls opened in places that, for health reasons, they shouldn't be opened, and all kinds of new techniques that will be riding on the wave of the COVID virus and exploring and experimenting with another way that you can stop people, discourage people, make it harder to vote rather than easier. So we have our work to do. We're actually going to work on a version of the film, Suppressed to 2020, in which will include some of the COVID material. And Casey and Laurie are working on that right now, sort of compiling some research and finding some stories that we'll tell. But it's going to make voting harder, and it's going to make voting suppression easier, and it's going to make our jobs more crucial than ever.
Phoebe, what's your take? Do you think there's enough voter interest in the 2020 election that will overcome some of these suppression techniques?
Well, I'm not sure that suppression has anything to do with interest. I think that, people will definitely try to vote, but as Robert was saying, I think it will be much, much harder to do so. And obviously we're in completely uncharted territory. We've never had to do something like this. And I think that will make it a lot easier to instate a lot of the suppression that we've been seeing, but in very different ways. I don't know what will come of this election. We will have to see, but I am sure that it will make voter suppression much, much easier. And I'm not necessarily sure that interest in voting will necessarily match getting to vote. I was very interested in voting. I did not get to vote. But I think that interest in voting in general does definitely help.
Robert, you had mentioned the Supreme Court ruling on prior clearance, which basically some states, particularly southern states, had to get approval that they were not discriminating. That ruling went the other way. Would that have made a difference in Georgia in 2018, in your view?
Had the Supreme Court not overturned a rule, a piece of legislation that fundamentally was there to guarantee people's right to vote. Let's be clear about this. The Supreme Court overturned that. Had they not done that, 90% of what happened in Georgia and in many other states would not have happened, because simply the rule's genius was you have to prove that everything is fair and open and everyone can vote before you can make any changes. So that's a big difference than making a change and then trying to pull it back or trying to stop it. Here you have to go in advance and say, look, everyone is voting. Everything is fair. It's all on the up and up. But the Supreme Court decided, no, that wasn't necessary anymore because there's no problem.
Interesting that, as you mentioned, the justice's rationale was that it's not the 1960s anymore. We're really playing with our archaic set of assumptions, but your documentary shows in many ways it still is the 1960s in Georgia and other places.
Yes, I mean, the 1960s, and as you know, Phoebe was talking about even earlier, we're working on another film now around misdemeanors and the racism in the system, and it goes right back to the era right around Reconstruction, where African Americans were voting in large numbers, getting elected all kinds of offices, and the Southern white supremacists and the Northern white supremacists could not take that. So they started to change the voting laws back then to make sure that African Americans were not able to vote. And that has stayed with us. And one of the tools of that has been the use of laws and misdemeanors and locking people up to take away their voting rights.
It's certainly, you mentioned both in the film fleetingly and in this conversation, gerrymandering and its effect on basically politicians choosing their voters and your upcoming documentary is certainly going to be important, but is gerrymandering on your radar as a potential documentary at some point?
Well, it's on the list of pages and pages and pages that I have here. I think there has been one or two documentaries done on gerrymandering, and hopefully there'll be more and other people will be doing it, because I'm not sure, there's 22 of us, and the production people, really, it's only about 7 or 8. So it limits what we can do.
Great. Well, I want to thank you, Robert Greenwald and Phoebe Einzig-Roth, for joining us today. I hope all of you watching have enjoyed this talk and a peek behind the scenes of the making of Suppress, the Fight to Vote. Now, if you want to get involved in this fight for democracy, I encourage you to check out the Take Action page on the Bay Area Book Festival's website, and that is www.baybookfest.org. I'm John Diaz, and thank you for watching Bay Area Book Festival Unbound.